Hello, welcome to the Rhetoric Central stream. This is the first ever stream on this channel. I've been doing stuff like this on a different YouTube channel for a number of years now. But for a story that doesn't need to be told, I am starting a new channel, which is right here on Rhetoric Central. So you might be coming to this because you're in a class of mine. I'm a professor of communication at DePaul University, or you might be coming to this randomly online for whatever reason because you're interested in this topic. So for this particular read-along, we are going to be looking at a somewhat famous piece by a pretty famous guy named Immanuel Kant, and this is his answer to a question: what is enlightenment? So I think a lot of us have probably heard a little bit about enlightenment. I'm going to start by giving you some context for this piece, and then we'll read it, and I'll continue to give context as we go along. If you're here and you are in the live chat, feel free to drop in any questions that you have as we read this piece together. Or if you're coming to this later in the VOD, then please leave a comment and I'll try to reply to the comment later. But there was let's call it a periodical magazine called the Berlinische Monatsschrift, which is a monthly magazine, which there's a lot of writing of different kinds published, just a miscellaneous group of things about science and literature and culture and all sorts of stuff that was happening. And as you can hear, it was based out of Berlin, and the Prussian Empire, I think it was at the time, the Prussian Empire and Frederick II was known for, even though he was an emperor, giving a lot of money or a lot of funding and support to the arts and sciences, which is why he was kind of known, which to us sounds funny, as an enlightened despot. So absolute ruler, but he had this kind of approach that gave a lot of support to this kind of public intellectualism. And in the 18th century, so we're in the 1780s here, I believe, there were a lot of things that were already happening. We're not going to go into a super deep historical background for this, but another man, his name was Zöllner, had written a piece in the same magazine, which was responding to a kind of movement that he felt was happening, which specifically had to do with whether clergy should be necessary for getting married. And he had heard some gossip, I guess, basically, that a lot of people felt that you don't need really clergy at weddings, that they're not really important. And so he himself, I think, was a clergyman, though he's also a Freemason. And as he's writing this piece about it, he says, well, what really is enlightenment? And that needs some answers to it. And many people responded to this, which was basically a footnote in a little article with their own piece. Before Kant, another famous person, his name was Moses Mendelssohn, responded to it, and then Kant also responded to it. But so many people did that a few years later, in the same magazine, we'll just call it the Berlin Monthly, something like that. In the same magazine, they said, here are the 21 different answers that have been given. Nobody knows what enlightenment is. So this didn't answer the question for everyone at the time. But another thing that I think is worth talking about here is when Kant is answering this question, what is enlightenment, not only is he responding to Zöllner, he's also kind of responding to how people are understanding themselves in this particular time. Especially groups of intellectuals, see themselves as Aufklärers, as people doing, carrying out enlightenment as a kind of civil, social, scientific process. And so Kant is one of these people. He's reflecting on his own sense of what he and these other intellectuals are kind of up to. There's a lot of things, though, that I think this essay has meant to other people. Some people have taken this as an answer to the question, what is enlightenment as a historical period? I think that's probably not the best way to read this, because it was an historical period to the people in the time with some kind of process that was happening. They didn't think of everything that was happening there, as we'll see in this piece, even, as already being enlightened or anything like that. And there was a lot of debate or discussion about what was enlightenment and what wasn't. So I'm coming to this piece because I'm interested in thinking about, with you, about what a public is, what publics do and how people have imagined the function of especially public criticism in the past, public criticism and argumentation. So this is the first piece we're reading in a class on that, because this sets out, I think, both a historical but a kind of idealized view of what a public might do in light of the state. So that's where we're at. We're going to get started here momentarily. I just want to make sure I have my preview up so I can see that you can see me. Well, I don't, but it'll be fine. So anyway, in answer to the question, what is enlightenment? Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. Self-incurred. So we're doing something to ourselves to keep ourselves immature. Immaturity is the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. So, you can't cross the street alone yet. You need somebody to hold your hand. This immaturity is self-incurred if its cause is not lack of understanding, but lack of resolution and courage to use it without the guidance of another. The motto of enlightenment is therefore sapere aude, which means dare to know. This is taken from a poem by the Latin poet Horace. Have courage to use your own understanding. Okay, well, that sounds very good. A lot of people have quoted this afterwards. Sapere aude. Dare to know. That's what's holding you back, is that you're timid. And that's kind of where some people stop reading this essay. They're like, yeah, that sounds pretty good. That's what they kind of get from it, which is we have to be bold and courageous. And a lot of people have taken that up in our contemporary discourse, the mantle of enlightenment, under that kind of, let's say, mood, that other people are, let's say, cowards, or they're timid, and that they keep themselves stupid and immature. If only they were able to speak the truth. But there's a little bit more going on here than just that. Laziness and cowardice are the reasons why such a large proportion of men, and here by men he means anybody, even when nature has long emancipated them from alien guidance, naturaliter maiores, nevertheless gladly remain immature for life. For the same reasons, it is all too easy for others to set themselves up as their guardians. It's so convenient to be immature. If I have a book to have understanding in place of me, so I say, oh, I don't know, I don't know anything about it, but the book says, well, what kind of books might those be? That could be even a sacred book, but it might be a law book, it might be a how-to guide. There's all sorts of things where you could put a book in place of your own understanding. Say, well, let's do it by the book. Let's go to the book and see what the book says. A spiritual advisor to have a conscience for me. So there's this famous play by Molière called Tartuffe, this French play from even before this was written, where some guy has the spiritual advisor who comes around, but he's like a horrible person. He's not really any good, but everyone kind of he keeps pretending to be pious, but the people that are employing him are like, well, oh wow, he's so holy, and so they let their spiritual life be led by this charlatan, right? So if you like, I don't need to have a conscience because my guru is going to tell me what to think or what to do or how to feel. A doctor to judge my diet for me. Well, no, wait a minute. So this is kind of an interesting thing. So far we've talked about books, spiritual advisors, and we might say, yeah, I get that. Well, why doctors? Today, I think a lot of people who think about the Enlightenment will maybe have signs that say, in this house, science is real. Or they might have a different political angle and they just be like, people are not willing to face what the scientific facts really are about X and so topic. But here, Kant is thinking about the doctor, the authority over you, as being part of this self-implied or self-incurred immaturity. I wonder what we would think about that today. Do doctors or people, those who study science, have a different relationship to authority than some of these others? Why or why not? And so on. I need not make any efforts at all. I need not think so long as I can pay. Others will soon enough take the tiresome job over for me. The guardians who have kindly taken upon themselves the work of supervision will soon see to it that by far the largest part of mankind, including the entire fair sex, that means women, should consider the step forward to maturity not only as difficult, but also as highly dangerous. Having first infatuated their domesticated animals, and carefully prevented the docile creatures from daring to take a single step without the leading strings to which they are tied. They next show them the danger which threatens them if they try to walk unaided. So, if you ever tried to, some parents have this theory of parenting where they're like, sometimes the kid will always come down at some point, I'm running away. Okay, go ahead. Let's see how far you get. And then when you get outside with your poorly packed little kid suitcase or just pillowcase, whatever you have, and you realize you don't know where you're going or what to do, you kind of go back, a little chastened. You say, okay, so you see why you need me now, right? That's what Kant is saying is happening here with these self-appointed guardians of over people's thinking. Now, this danger is not, in fact, so very great, for they would certainly learn to walk eventually after a few falls. But an example of this kind is intimidating and usually frightens them off from further attempts. Thus, I just want to check something. Yeah, we're all good. Thus, it is difficult for each separate individual to work his way out of the immaturity which has become almost second nature to him. He has even grown fond of it and is really incapable for the time being of using his own understanding because he was never allowed to make the attempt. This is reminding me of a few things, which is not really exactly what Kant is thinking about, but maybe different ways we might approach a similar idea. I've heard people have talked about this in terms of one of the disadvantages of living in a patriarchal society, which is maybe not the most obvious one, which is with men do everything for you. If you're a woman and men are doing everything for you, maybe in a way that's very polite or courteous, you literally never get a chance to try to do those things yourself. And so you become less capable as a person. There's no time to try these things for yourself. So you know less about the world because someone is always watching over you and guarding you and saying that they're helping you, but really kind of making you less experienced. I think there's also something that I think about here about this kind of second nature. This is what Aristotle said about habit, that habit becomes a second nature to us. So our habits are very comforting. Even habits that we know are bad can be very comforting. They're hard to break. They're a kind of second nature. We are identified with them in multiple ways, these habits that we have. And so when it comes to thinking, one of the habits that I think a lot of us have that does, I think, still come from largely what we would consider education, which is supposed to kind of take us out of our ignorance, is that we're supposed to know stuff. And so that when we come across doubt, something that's doubtful, we try to figure out immediately what are we supposed to know? What's the answer to the test? And we rarely have time to think about, well, maybe nobody knows, or maybe I don't know. How would I find out for myself? On the other hand, there's also the kind of reaction to that, which a lot of people, I would say, will say something like, do your own research, which is a motto of a lot of, let's say, the anti-vaccine movement. Do your own research. Well, what's their research look like? For them, the research is still what other people say, but they have this sense that something is being kind of hidden from them, that they have been misled by these so-called guardians of thought, and that there's some other person who presents themselves as being at the same level or of having kind of broken through something who will now lead you in another direction. Now, if you didn't even have that, what would you do? If you really didn't know something and you weren't sure who did know something, that would be a very uncomfortable position to be in. And I think it's nice to take on the heroic side of that and say, just stand up for what you really believe. But what about the moment where I really don't know what I believe and I don't know how? Having the habit of being in uncertainty is something that very few formal education systems really help us with. So education itself might be a problem here. Dogmas and formulas, those mechanical instruments for rational use, or rather misuse, of his natural endowments, are the ball and chain of his permanent immaturity. And who is he talking about here? Any individual. And if anyone did throw them off, he would still be uncertain about jumping over even the narrowest of trenches, for he would be unaccustomed to free movement of this kind. Thus only a few, by cultivating their own minds, have succeeded in freeing themselves from immaturity and in continuing boldly on their own way. In the 50s, I think, there was some research done on, I don't remember this very well, chimpanzees, monkeys of some kind, apes of some kind, who were caged and kind of put in a situation where they were not allowed to access, in the time that Kant was writing this. He was mostly thinking about print, the printed word. For there will always be a few who think for themselves, even among those appointed as guardians of the common mass. Such guardians, once they have themselves thrown off the yoke of immaturity, will disseminate the spirit of rational respect for personal value and for the duty of all men to think for themselves. It's your duty to think for yourself. The remarkable thing about this is that if the public, which was previously put under this yoke by the guardians, is suitably stirred up by some of the latter who are incapable of enlightenment, it may subsequently compel the guardians themselves to remain under the yoke. For it is very harmful to propagate prejudices because they finally avenge themselves on the very people who first encouraged them, or whose predecessors did so. Thus a public can only achieve enlightenment slowly. So, the process of enlightenment isn't the kind of immediate pointing to a fact. Aha, there's a scientific discovery. We know it. Enlightenment is a process, or is being imagined as a process here. It's something that happens over time. It's a historical process by which we come to see the prejudices that we have slowly erode in light of the historical evidence amassed in a public and published and discussed in a public. A revolution may well put an end to autocratic despotism and to rapacious or power-seeking oppression, but it will never produce a true reform in ways of thinking. Now, at this point in time, if I have my dates correct, of the world revolutions that are very familiar to us, the only one that's really happened is the American Revolution. The French and the Haitian revolutions have not yet occurred. Kant will live to see these, or at least the French, yeah. Anyway, I forget when he dies, but he has some thoughts about the French Revolution. But there also are other things that you might call a revolution, like the English Civil War and the beheading of Charles I, that also would have kind of come to mind. This putting down, this overthrowing of tyrants or despots. There are other periods of history where such things happen. So he's saying, yeah, that may overcome oppression, but it won't make you think differently. New prejudices, like the ones they replace, will serve as a leash to control the great unthinking mass. This is Kant's opinion, of course. For enlightenment of this kind, all that is needed is freedom. And the freedom in question is the most innocuous form of all. Freedom to make public use of one's reason in all matters. It's interesting to say innocuous. So innocuous means here it's harmless. It's not going to do anything. In a different piece called On the Contest of the Faculties that Kant writes, he basically says that this kind of public use of one's reason really is just like gossip. It's like political gossip. It's not going to be that serious. Now, some people who have written about this later on have said that's because Kant is trying to make it look innocuous to Frederick II, to other world leaders at the time who were afraid of this kind of stuff. And he's saying, no, look, this is not the dangerous form. But this is going to have a powerful impact. It's hard to have both of those positions at the same time. That enlightenment is really important. The public is really important. It needs to become enlightened and lose its immaturity. But also, giving people the freedom to do that, it's not going to make a big difference. You can see why there's a little bit of tension there. But I hear on all sides the cry, don't argue. The officer says, don't argue, get on parade. Meaning the military officer in this case. The tax official, don't argue, pay. The clergyman, don't argue, believe. Only one ruler in the world says, argue as much as you like, and about whatever you like, but obey. And this is Frederick II, who is his own ruler. Kant lived in Königsberg, and famously didn't really leave his own town very much. People said that they could set their watches based on when he was taking his walk. He was a very regular and exact kind of guy. He was a lifelong bachelor. So, nevertheless, he was involved in some of the top-level stuff that was happening in his society at that time, largely through correspondence. All this means restrictions on freedom everywhere. But which sort of restriction prevents enlightenment, and which, instead of hindering it, can actually promote it? I reply, the public use of man's reason must always be free, and it alone can bring about enlightenment among men. The private use of reason may quite often be very narrowly restricted, however, without undue hindrance to the progress of enlightenment. I think this strikes us right now as very weird. We're first going to have to see, well, what does he really mean by these? But if we took our intuitive sense of what he meant by these, of the private use of your reason, I would think of the private use of my reason would be kind of when I'm at home. So it sounds like what he's saying at first is, say whatever you want in public. You should always be free to do that. But the government can restrict what you privately think? That's so crazy. Okay, that's not what he means. But it's interesting to think about why that's not even on the agenda here. The private sphere, the sense of what we might also call the intimate sphere as being the home, the family, isn't even really being considered as an important part of the discourse that's relevant here. It's not even being imagined. Later on, it will be, not more into the 19th century. It will start to become that place. But there's also, so in France, where Frederick II was a great admirer of France, Prussians and other German-speaking peoples often looked to France and they felt that the French were more cultivated. There was the phenomenon of the salon, the salon, where often highly wealthy and highly cultivated French women of the aristocracy would open up their private homes, their maisons, with these salons, for public gatherings. They were friendly, they played games, they had literary discussions, but this was kind of sometimes thought about as one of the first images of what the public was. In England, coffee had become very popular, and it was these coffee houses, these places where people would come and meet with a drink. Now, that to us, I think, feels a little bit more like what we might imagine as being a public space. But the public is not necessarily concerned in this moment with whether it's inside of someone's personal residence or in a kind of public place. It's more about the nature of the discourse and, as we'll see, what kind of persona you are occupying in the discourse. So when I'm speaking, am I speaking as a citizen or am I speaking as someone with a role in society? And that's kind of weird. Kant wants to see these as distinct. So someone who is a priest, when they're speaking in their role as a citizen, they are using their public reason. But if they are taking on the office of a priest, or if they're taking on the office of a military officer, then that's what he means. The private use of your reason is weirdly what we would maybe think of more about one's public role, your job, your profession. He's like, no, that's your private role. You are specifically appointed to that. That might be restricted. And we do kind of see that today in the United States. In other places, it varies how much. Sometimes there's more restriction or less restriction. But if you're a member of the military in the United States, while you are in the military and representing the military, you're not allowed to make political statements. But this does not seem to violate free speech because you still have that right as a citizen. You still have that right as being when you're representing the armed forces. So there might be case law about that complicates what I just said, but that's the general kind of going understanding of that distinction. So we still have that, but in a different way, and we understand it differently now. But by the public use of one's reason, I mean the use which anyone may make of it as a man of learning, addressing the entire reading public. Now this is also kind of weird. And I said before when he said men, he meant all people, including women. Here I'm not so sure. Well, for one reason, it was really hard to become a woman of learning at this period. There were highly learned women. Often they were ridiculed or mocked by others. There's this group in England called the Blue Stockings, so they were mocked for how they went about. But there was Catherine the Great in Russia. There were women rulers who were highly educated, Elizabeth of Bohemia in the 17th century. And there were women philosophers and scientists who, in the, as they called it, the Republic of Letters, were addressing a reading public. But this was not something that was genuinely open to women. So here, man of learning is thinking of someone who is literate, but not just someone who can read, someone who has studied, perhaps at university, addressing in a reading public, meaning other people who are interested in reading this kind of material. So this idea of the public doesn't mean everybody. It doesn't even mean all subjects of the king or anything like that, because literacy, I don't know the exact literacy rates in Prussia at this time, but it's not going to be close to what we would imagine now. So it excludes everyone who is illiterate. And it also isn't including just people who read anything. Let's say there might be a reading public in a certain sense that's very interested in devotional materials, or it's very interested in reading things about religion. This was a lot of what people were reading at the time. But it wouldn't be reading, let's say, the Berlinische Monatsschrift, which is this kind of higher level stuff. So the image of the public here is pretty reduced down to a certain kind of person who's capable of participating in this kind of discourse, both as a writer and a reader. So the public use of one's reason, weirdly, it's like more like people writing to academic journals, which is not what we generally think of as the public today. What I term the private use of reason is that which a person may make of it in a particular civil post or office with which he's entrusted. And that's the bit I was trying to explain earlier, which is weird. Why is a civil post private? Because, you would think of that. But anyway, that's how he is making this distinction. Now, in some affairs which affect the interests of the Commonwealth, we require a certain mechanism whereby some members of the Commonwealth must behave purely passively, so that they may, by an artificial common agreement, be employed by the government for public ends, or at least deterred from vitiating them. It is, of course, impermissible to argue in such cases. Obedience is imperative. But insofar as this or that individual who acts as part of the machine also considers him, and for Kant, the machine is good. He's like, yeah, be part of the machine. We need it. We need better administration. This is a lot of, insofar as Kant had a politics, he didn't, I don't know, people argue about whether he did or not. He was pretty much interested in a more effective administration and perpetual peace between nations. That's kind of what he was interested in. As part of the machine, also considers himself as a member of a complete commonwealth or even a cosmopolitan society. Cosmopolitan meaning, sort of like the global, a citizen of the globe, you could say, maybe we would say today. And thence as a man of learning who may through his writings address a public in the truest sense of the word, he may indeed argue without harming the affairs in which he is employed for some of the time in a passive capacity. Thus, it would be very harmful if an officer receiving an order from his superiors were to quibble openly, while on duty, about the appropriateness or usefulness of the order in question. He must simply obey. But he cannot reasonably be banned from making observations as a man of learning on the errors in the military service, and from submitting these to his public for judgment. So, when you're in the forces and someone gives you an order, you have to do it. This is not a space for public deliberation. But if you want to go write your memoirs later on and criticize military policy, that's totally acceptable. The citizen cannot refuse to pay the taxes imposed upon him. Presumptuous criticisms of such taxes, where someone is called upon to pay them, may be punished as an outrage, which could lead to general insubordination. Nonetheless, the same citizen does not contravene his civil obligations if, as a learned individual, notice how he keeps pointing that out, he publicly voices his thoughts on the impropriety or even injustice of such fiscal measures. In the same way, a clergyman is bound to instruct his pupils and his congregation in accordance with the doctrines of the church he serves, for he was employed by it on that condition. But as a scholar, he is completely free as well as obliged to impart to the public all his carefully considered, well-intentioned thoughts on the mistaken aspects of those doctrines, and to offer suggestions for a better arrangement of religious and ecclesiastical affairs. This is, it's kind of weird, right, to say, if you're a minister, you actually have a duty to, if you believe that there is something wrong with the doctrines of your church, you have a duty to publicly criticize it this way. But when you're acting as a minister, you should absolutely not do that at all. And it's like, well, it's just hard for me to imagine how that distinction would be understood or upheld by the public or by the people that are I guess, employing you in the church. It's like, what? How would that work? But this is the distinction Kant is trying to draw. And there is nothing in this which need trouble the conscience. For what he teaches in pursuit of his duties as an active servant of the church is presented by him as something which he is not empowered to teach at his own discretion, but which he is employed to expound in a prescribed manner and in someone else's name. He will say, our church teaches this or that, and these are the arguments it uses. He then extracts as much practical value as possible for his congregation from precepts to which he would not himself subscribe with full conviction, which he can nevertheless undertake to expound, since it is not in fact wholly impossible that they may contain truth. Okay, that doesn't sound like a very rousing sermon to me, but at all events, nothing opposed to the essence of religion is present in such doctrines. For if the clergyman thought he could find anything of this sort in them, he would not be able to carry out his official duties in good conscience, and would have to resign. Thus, the use which someone employed as a teacher makes of his reason in the presence of his congregation is purely private, since a congregation, however large it is never any more than a domestic gathering. Now, this again is I find this very weird. The use which someone employed as a teacher makes of his reason in the presence of his congregation is purely private. So this could be a teacher in the sense, he says congregation, so you might imagine it in a religious sense, but you can also think about professors. So, in a certain sense, like what I'm doing right now, which to me seems very public, putting this online, could be construed as being private. I don't know. I mean, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, but this is what it seems like Kant is saying. In view of this, he is not and cannot be free as a priest, since he is acting on commission imposed from outside. Conversely, as a scholar addressing the real public, that is, the world at large, through his writings, the clergyman making public use of his own reason enjoys unlimited freedom to use his own reason and to speak in his own person. For to maintain that the guardians of the people in spiritual matters should themselves be immature is an absurdity which amounts to making absurdities permanent. But should not a society of clergymen, and society here doesn't mean, the general society. It means any kind of group of clergymen. For example, an ecclesiastical synod or a venerable presbytery. So this is, any kind of church group. The synods or the presbyters mean elders. So like a council of elders. Be entitled to commit itself by oath to a certain unalterable set of doctrines in order to secure for all time a constant guardianship over each of its members, and through them over the people. I reply that this is quite impossible. Now, some people in the class that I am reading this with were like, yeah, it made a lot of sense until I got into all this religious stuff. And a lot of this is about religion. And at the end of the piece, he's like, yeah, I'm sorry about that. So on the one hand, we might remember that this is responding to Zellner's piece that had something to do with clergy officiating marriages and how important clergy were to that. But I think that it really is at this period of time what people are mostly thinking about in terms of social arguments in public, is often about religious matters. But of course, there are also political matters that people, at least intellectuals of the time, are arguing about. Sometimes they are being invited to argue about them by rulers even. So why is Kant not really mentioning that? There might be something to think through as you keep reading this piece. A contract of this kind, concluded with a view to preventing all further enlightenment of mankind forever, is absolutely null and void, even if it is ratified by the supreme power, by imperial diets, and the most solemn peace treaties. One age cannot enter into an alliance on oath to put the next age in its position, where it be impossible for it to extend and correct its knowledge, particularly on such important matters, or to make any progress whatsoever in enlightenment. So if you think, I think this is much more common in Christianity than in the history of other religions, where there are councils that convene and come up with decisions about Christian doctrine. So the Council of Nicaea is one of the ancient ones. And then that would mean that all future Christians are supposed to adhere to what's decided at that council. After the Protestant Reformation, and there were splits in the church that didn't lead to any fewer councils happening. But what Kant's saying here is basically nobody can tell people what can be believed for all time. which is relatively radical for this period in time. And Kant himself was a Christian. I believe he was a Lutheran. I'm not sure about that. He certainly wasn't a typical. He had a kind of idiosyncratic view of religion for sure, but he was religious. This would be a crime against human nature, whose original destiny lies precisely in such progress. Later generations are thus perfectly entitled to dismiss these agreements as unauthorized and criminal. To test whether any particular measure can be agreed upon as a law for a people, we need only ask whether a people could well impose such a law upon itself. This might well be possible for a specified short period as a means of introducing a certain order, pending, as it were, a better solution. This would also mean that each citizen, particularly the clergyman, would be given a free hand as a scholar to comment publicly, that is in his writings, on the inadequacies of current institutions. Meanwhile, the newly established order would continue to exist until public insight into the nature of such matters had progressed and proved itself to the point whereby general consent, if not unanimously, a proposal could be submitted to the crown, the ruler. And he is pretty much always imagining a monarchy, which makes sense in the period. Most places are monarchies. In some way, in Europe anyway. This would seek to protect the congregations who had, for instance, agreed to alter their religious establishment in accordance with their own notions of what higher insight is. But it would not try to obstruct those who wanted to let things remain as before. But it is absolutely impermissible to agree, even for a single lifetime, to a permanent religious constitution which no one might publicly question. For this would virtually nullify a phase in man's upward progress, thus making it fruitless and even detrimental to subsequent generations. A man may, for his own person, and even then only for a limited period, postpone enlightening himself in matters he ought to know about. But to renounce such enlightenment completely, whether for his own person or even more so for later generations, means violating and trampling underfoot the sacred rights of mankind. So, saying that there are certain things that we can't know about or questions we shouldn't ask, Kant's willing to make a compromise and say, okay, for a limited period of time you might do that. There might be some kind of practical reason. But you cannot make that a principle for other people, and especially for other generations in the future. So there is a sense here of enlightenment as historical progress, that there is going to be a process that happens across generations that will lead to greater enlightenment. And it is talked about here as knowledge. It would be good to know what the word is in German, because there are different words in German for knowledge, exactly that Kant has in mind. But I guess one of the things that's weird is why this is being understood as knowledge. I think many people today, whether they are religious or not, wouldn't necessarily see religious conviction as being part of knowledge. And again, especially in Christianity, where faith, when you don't have knowledge, can be seen as a virtue. They're the so-called revealed religions, even though they may not all have revealed the same thing. So Judaism, Islam, Christianity, in a certain sense, certain interpretation, aspects of the Buddhist tradition, religions of revelation make claims to knowledge. That something is known on the basis of the revelation through an angel or the word of God or something like that, by a prophet. But obviously, if it's a revealed knowledge and it's from God, then it's not in a process of change and development like science. So there's something actually kind of really weird here about what Kant is saying, that there has to be some kind of progress of religious knowledge. What would that be? Most religious people, if they believe there's religious knowledge, would put it on a sense of religious revelation. Maybe there are some people that are like, I'm on my spiritual journey, I'm kind of coming to know things through spiritual practice. But that's also not what he's talking about here. He's talking about the public use of one's reason. So what exactly Kant has in mind, I don't know. I really don't. But I think it's interesting to think about what that could be, or what that might be analogous to in our contemporary world, which might include questions of religion, but might also have other questions that we could think about, being this idea of something that can progress in terms of public knowledge, only in public and through public discourse. Okay, so long as he sees to it that all true or imagined improvements are compatible with the civil order, he can otherwise leave his subjects to do whatever they find necessary for their salvation, which is none of his business. But it's his excuse me. But it is his business to stop anyone forcibly hindering others from working as best as they can to define and promote their salvation. It indeed detracts from his majesty if he interferes in these affairs by subjecting the writings in which his subjects attempt to clarify their religious ideas to governmental supervision. This applies if he does so acting upon his own exalted opinions, in which case he exposes himself to the reproach, Caesar non est supra grammaticos. Caesar is not above the grammarians. So even the emperor is subject to good syntax. There are certain kind of laws that can't become commands or can't be kind of refuted by commands, political rule or law. But much more so if he demeans his high authority so far as to support the spiritual despotism of a few tyrants within his state against the rest of his subjects. If it is now asked whether we at present live in an enlightened age, the answer is no, but we do live in an age of enlightenment. This is also kind of interesting because a lot of times people will think about enlightenment, especially in English, as the end goal. And here, again, Kant clearly sees this as a process. No, we're not enlightened. That's why it's enlightenment. It's happening. It's something that's ongoing. As things are at present, we will still have a long way to go before men as a whole can be in a position, or can even be put into a position, of using their own understanding confidently and well in religious matters, without outside guidance. But we do have distinct indications that the way is now being cleared for them to work freely in this direction, and that the obstacles to universal enlightenment, to man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity, are gradually becoming fewer. In this respect, our age is the age of enlightenment, the century of Frederick. Again, Frederick II. That seems like a little bit of ass-kissing to me, I have to admit. Don't you think? Like, really? We're giving a lot of praise to the emperor here. A prince who does not, in this famous document about enlightenment and freedom, a prince who does not regard it as beneath him to say that he considers it his duty in religious matters not to prescribe anything to his people, but to allow them complete freedom. A prince who thus even declines to accept the presumptuous title of tolerant is himself enlightened. Okay, again, you should double check me on this, but I'm pretty sure that one of the things that Frederick II did during his rule of the Prussian Empire was he gave some legal toleration to the religious observance of Jews as well as Catholics. I think that's as far as it extended. But there probably were not many other types of religious belief. And of course, Protestantism, there were many different types of Protestantism also. So religious toleration being kind of protection from legal persecution, not necessarily social discrimination, which will become more important in the 20th century. Not more important, but will have a different status in terms of how we think about what religious toleration involves. He deserves to be praised by a grateful present in posterity as the man who first liberated mankind from immaturity, as far as government is concerned, who left all men free to use their reason in all matters of conscience. Again, it also feels weird being like, oh wow, the immaturity is when someone is a guardian over you. But let's praise this person who's a guardian over all of us for freeing us from that. Okay, why? Because he's allowing intellectuals a greater degree of freedom than they might otherwise have. Okay. Under his rule, ecclesiastical dignitaries, notwithstanding their official duties, may in their capacity as scholars freely and publicly submit to the judgment of the world their verdicts and opinions, even if these deviate here and there from orthodox doctrine. This applies even more to all others who are not restricted by any official duties. This spirit of freedom is also spreading abroad, even where it has to struggle with outward obstacles imposed by governments which misunderstand their own function. For such governments can now witness a shining example of how freedom may exist without in the least jeopardizing public concord and the unity of the Commonwealth. Men will of their own accord gradually work their way out of barbarism, so long as artificial measures are not deliberately adopted to keep them in it. A couple of things that I want to say that are weird here already. He's talked about this being a gradual process a few times now, but it doesn't really explain how the process will work. It's just going to happen I mean, we now have these ideas of, okay, the marketplace of ideas, and we'll have the best idea win out. But he doesn't make that claim. That's not part of this imagination of how enlightenment will work in a public sphere. So, okay. And then there's also this thing about in your capacity as a scholar, that the public that Kant is imagining is kind of a public of scholars. That in order to appear in the public, if you're going to write something to the public, you have to be learned, you have to be a scholar, and that you have to assume that persona when you write for a public. That seems pretty different to me than a lot of the posting that people do on social media now. People aren't saying, well, as a scholar, look at this crazy thing I saw. It would be weird. If someone kept saying that as a scholar, I mean, I guess I see this on academic Twitter, and I find it really annoying when they do that. As a scholar, I have portrayed matters of religion as the focal point of enlightenment, that is, of man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. This is firstly because our rulers have no interest in assuming the role of guardians over their subjects so far as the arts and sciences are concerned. And secondly, because religious immaturity is the most pernicious and dishonorable variety of all. But the attitude of mind of a head of state who favors freedom in the arts and sciences extends even further. For he realizes that there is no danger even to his legislation if he allows his subjects to make public use of their own reason, and to put before the public their thoughts on better ways of drawing up laws, even if this entails forthright criticism of the current legislation. So, again, it's this thing of saying it's really important that people do this, use this public use of reason, but we don't have to be afraid of it at all because it has no danger to the legislation. If people just constantly criticize it in public, the public has no force to it other than this force that we could call enlightenment. So, is this a theory of change that Kant's just slow rolling out here and saying, okay, well, eventually people would choose the better thing? Or is it a compromised position that he has to write it like this because of the political conditions under which he's writing? I don't think it's simple to interpret this, what he's actually after here. But only a ruler who is himself enlightened and has no fear of phantoms, yet who likewise has at hand a well-disciplined and numerous army to guarantee public security, may say what no republic would dare to say. Argue as much as you like and about whatever you like, but obey. Now, this kind of reminds me famously of what George W. Bush said about democracy while there were protests about the Iraq War. And some journalist asked him about whether he felt that he was violating democracy. Hello, Vaza. The cat has entered the room. And he's like, look out there. Democracy is happening. There's the protest. There's the democracy. Argue as much as you like about whatever you like, but obey. You could kind of say it again. Now, Kant's saying that that's a noble thing to say. That we have the realm of argument and we have the realm of obedience, and they're separate. The public and what he's calling, weirdly, I think, the private, the realm of obedience. This reveals to us a strange and unexpected pattern in human affairs, such as we shall always find, if we consider them in the widest sense, in which nearly everything is paradoxical. A high degree of civil freedom seems advantageous to a people's intellectual freedom. Yet it also sets up insuperable barriers to it. Conversely, a lesser degree of civil freedom gives intellectual freedom enough room to expand to its fullest extent. Thus, once the germ on which nature has lavished most care, man's inclination and vocation to think freely, has developed within this hard shell, it gradually reacts upon the mentality of the people, who thus gradually become increasingly able to act freely. This is a very weird passage, and someone in the class has already pointed this out as being kind of confusing. And I have to say, I don't have an answer to exactly what Kant's imagining here, and I'm pretty suspicious of this view that Kant's putting forward. But you could imagine it this way. Let's try to give it a charitable reading. In a situation where you're not capable of putting forward a lot of political, civil, free discourse, some of those energies that might be expended in the public realm return into the intellectual realm, into the private life, are kind of worked out there. And that's the hard shell that it's being developed within. But somehow, in a way that Kant doesn't really put forward how it's going to happen, that some of these intellectual engagements will eventually, as they take on the public character in some way, will help the people to act freely. I don't know. I really don't understand. I don't understand even what Kant. It's kind of mysterious. I want to read what other people have written about it. Eventually, it even influences the principles of governments, which find that they can themselves profit by treating man, who is more than a machine, in a manner appropriate to his dignity. So one of the reasons why I wanted to read this text is just because it is so weird. And so when people kind of glibly say, we have to return to Enlightenment ideals, or we talk about kind of freedom of speech and the courage to speak in public, it might sound very similar in certain respects to what's going on here in this document from the so-called Enlightenment, but then you start to read it and say there's something that's very weird about it. The sense that to be in public is not to present yourself as an expert on something in terms of your professional role, but as a learned person, as a scholar that's distinct from that in some way. Okay, that's weird. That the public realm, the importance of it is not about changing currently existing legislation, but just about the process of enlightenment itself, which maybe in some way will somehow in the future lead to better laws or better social arrangements, not kind of totally worked out. And the fact that a lot of this has to do with the criticism of religion, but not the criticism of religious belief, not the criticism of religion as to core, but the way that the religious life is understood, practiced, and lived by some group of people, I think is also maybe a surprising thing about what enlightenment looks like here. So hopefully this gave you some sense of what the Enlightenment might mean in terms of this one document. But let's also not make the mistake of saying that this document is the answer to the question, what is enlightenment? It's one answer to the question by a very notable person, and it's honestly still pretty confusing. So thank you for coming to this read-along. If you liked this, if you want to hear more close readings like this for whatever reason, you can subscribe to the channel. And this is where I will do them. I will do them live on YouTube in the future. There's also a Discord, and if you're interested in participating in that, if you're not already in there, there should be a link on the channel's homepage, and you can join and we can talk there as well. So until